Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on our changes to professional practical experience, or PPE, as we sometimes call it. Thank you for joining us. We're really pleased to have you here with us today as we talk through the changes we've announced, and why we're making them, and what they mean for trainees, learning providers, and others involved in professional practical experience. My name is Finn, and I'll be facilitating today's session, and I'm joined by Simon Howard, our Director of Strategy, and Grant Dybel, our Head of Accreditation. So they're going to be taking you through the changes with a slideshow, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end to answer your questions. So just before we do get started, just a couple of practical points. We are going to record today's session, and we will be sharing the recording after the webinar. So if you're not able to stay right until the very end, don't worry. And again, if you would like to share that recording with colleagues, we would definitely encourage that. We've turned the chat function off, but we would encourage you to make use of the Q&A function, which you can locate at the bottom of your screen. So you can submit questions at any point during this webinar, and we'll come back to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. So I think with that, I'll hand over to Simon to start the presentation.
Thanks, Finn. Are you going to share the slides?
I am.
Afternoon, everyone. Like Finn says, thanks for joining us. I guess today's really about explaining where we've landed on professional practical experience, PPE, following the work of the PPE Commission that took place last year and the subsequent consultation that took place earlier this year. And the starting point for all of this, I think, was really quite simple, is in the sense that practical experience, I think it's all been agreed for a long period of time that practical experience is a really crucial part of becoming an architect. But the feedback that we were consistently getting over the past few years is that the quality of that experience has been too variable, and the system hasn't really given trainees or employees enough clarity about what good experience looks like. So today we've published the final package of changes, and I'm going to take you through what has changed, what hasn't, and importantly, what this means in practice for learning providers, whether you're on the call as a learning provider, as a trainee or a student, or as an employer. So, Finn, if you want to move on to the next slide, please. So there's quite a lot been published today, as you can see here, but I'm going to focus on the changes that matter most rather than taking you through every document. So these are the things that I'm going to take you through: the revised standards for learning providers. So these are the standards that all learning providers, whether it be schools of architecture or other learning providers, must meet in order to have their qualifications accredited by ARB. And the details of that are in an updated handbook. There's new guidance for employers and trainees, for employers who are going to employ trainees as part of their PPE, what their responsibilities are. What the requirements are for having a trainee record of experience, most commonly known as a PDR at the moment, but we call it a trainee record of experience that was recommended by the PPE Commission. The changes we're going to make to the minimum 2-year requirement for practical experience, and I'll come on to those as well. All of these are going to be explained on our education website page. And then finally, Grant is going to talk particularly to learning providers about our transition plans to the new requirements. Thanks, Finn. So the PPE Commission, it's probably worth reminding ourselves where this work came from. So the PPE Commission, which, as I said, was appointed in 2024, was a reaction to the consistent feedback that trainees in particular, but also employers, and to be fair, also learning providers, gave us about the challenges in relation to the quality and consistency of practical experience, that there were unsupported conditions. There was a lot of confusion about what the responsibility of a learning provider was, what the responsibility of an employer was, and to be fair, also what the responsibilities of a trainee were. And that PPE Commission, which published its report last year, it's a wide-ranging report, but the really key recommendations were that more flexibility was required on ARB's behalf, to allow learning providers to create qualifications that they thought would meet the outcomes in the best possible way for their trainees and for their students, and more flexibility, particularly for trainees, about how they might be able to acquire their practical experience, particularly in relation to not necessarily being with one practice and being stuck there. That learning providers should take more of a coordinating role over the practical experience that trainees were able to get, and we can talk a little bit more about the nuances of what a coordinating role means in the next slide. But quite clearly, also workplace culture must be improved, and there were too many examples that we had and the PPE Commission heard of poor culture, particularly in relation to a misbalance of power, and maltreatment of trainees. So one of the biggest changes, sorry, Finn, can you go on to the next slide, please? So the standards of providers are the requirements of all learning providers must meet in order for ARB to accredit their qualifications that would then ultimately lead to registration. And one of the biggest changes we've tried to make is to make a clearer role for learning providers. So it's really clear that we're not expecting them to manage trainees' employment, and neither do we expect them to become a kind of quasi-regulator of employers, because we know that they can't do that. Ultimately, there is a limit to what learning providers can do in relation to the experience available in their area, or wherever, in relation to practice. But what we've done and what the Commission sought to do is look for the best practice that was being carried out by learning providers, and try and inculcate that into the handbook to try and make it so everybody can follow that best practice. So anything that we're suggesting that learning providers must do is eminently doable, because there are some people already out there doing it. So across all qualifications, whether it be just those ones who are offering the academic outcomes or the practice outcomes as well, there's now a requirement for them to have an individual oversight of progression, and that just means supporting employability, providing trainees with advice and practical experience how to do this. Then there are some more specific requirements in relation to those qualifications that have the practice level qualifications. One of those is to have a trainee record of experience, and to advise trainees about their progress. And I'll come on to that on the next slide. But also in relation to have that coordinating role, is to have an appointed individual /z, to maintain contact with trainees during their employment, and to assist trainees, and to provide them with good advice, and also develop relationships with employers to support trainees. And as the slide says, there we've published examples of what they can do. To be really clear, one of the proposals that we've made in the PPE Commission was that learning providers would have a much more stringent responsibility in relation to ensuring the quality of the experience provided by trainees. That's not our proposal now. We consulted on that. We heard back that was impractical, and potentially had some adverse side effects that we wouldn't, and unintended consequences. So we're not saying that a learning provider, a university, is responsible for the practical experience that a trainee gets. But what we are saying is that they have responsibility to coordinate and help all of those concerned in that space. Thanks, Finn. So one of the consistent messages we were having, we got back over the past few years, is there is a genuine confusion and a lack of clarity about everybody's responsibility in this. So we've published two pieces of guidance. One is for employers to say, if you were going to take on a trainee, these are the kind of responsibilities you have. These are some practical steps that you can make sure that that you can ensure that The trainee is has a clarity of what they're supposed to be doing and what your responsibilities are if you're going to take on this responsibility, and what the kind of whistleblowing, and if when something goes wrong, what do you do? So there's a range of information in there. And similarly, to be fair, and this was a feedback that we consistently got from employers, that trainees also need to have that information of what they can expect of their employer, but also their responsibilities as well. So roles and responsibilities really important. What we expect from both trainees and employers in relation to behaviours and workplace culture, and then talking about specific things that will help both of them in terms of setting objectives, checking progression, providing them with support and supervision, and also some minimum conditions of employment that are really just explaining what the legal minimums are anyway, that some people we're having some concerns about, and what to do in respect of concerns or whistleblowing in relation to the experience that people were having during their placements. Thanks, Finn. So the next thing that we've published is a minimum requirements for a trainee record of experience. Now, this is something that the PPE Commission identified as being a really important document, where a trainee can map and reflect and record their progress in relation to experience and map that against the practice outcomes, so they can clearly understand where they are in terms of their progression and what the gaps are, and whether they are able to fill those gaps within that with their current employer, or whether they need to fill those gaps in an alternative way. Now, we know that there is the existing the main trainee record of experience at the moment is the PEDR, and we have been working in conjunction with our colleagues over at the RIBA to ensure that, or to hope to ensure that the PEDR can meet those minimum requirements, and we're confident that that's going to be able to happen. But ultimately, anybody can produce a record of experience as long as it meets those minimum requirements, which will include mapping to the practice outcomes, to allow a student or trainee, sorry, to be able to log and reflect and corroborate on their experience, and allow for their experience to be corroborated by an overseeing architect, and they're able to take that with them. It's a document that they own rather than the provider owns. So there has to be transferability and portability, and there are also some additional requirements in relation to data protection and cost and things like that. It is not our intention to create our own trainee record of experience, because we think the sector is more than capable of doing that itself. If the sector doesn't, then we consider doing that. But ultimately, this isn't a document that we would look at. This is a document that the trainee would own and use with their learning provider to demonstrate their experience in relation to ultimately gaining the qualification. So possibly the most controversial, the change that will get most attention is our proposal now. Well, it's not our proposal. It is something that we've decided to do, is to remove the 2-year minimum period of practical experience. Now, I need to stress this really clearly, that removing a 2-year minimum period, does not reduce the standard required to become a registered architect, and in most instances, it probably doesn't even reduce the amount of time. The logic behind it is that a time spent carrying out practical experience is a poor proxy for competence, and there will always be trainees who are capable of gaining that practical experience in a quicker time. So what we're saying is that the real test should be, has the trainee met all the competence outcomes, rather than they have spent 2 years sitting there and therefore can therefore expect to be able to be registered. That would be a misleading position. Sorry, Finn, can you just go back one? So the guidance that we will set out is that the time required to do this will vary, and we know from feedback from learning providers and from employers that for most trainees, actually 2 years is a bit irrelevant, because they will take more than that to reach the required standard and meet all the practice outcomes. But what it will allow to do is allow allow providers to have more flexibility to develop qualifications that can blend academia and practice in a kind of circular learning way. So that is something that that we're going to that will now be available for people to be able to qualify a little quicker. Grant, I'll hand over to you in relation to transition.
Thank you, Simon. I think probably there's quite a lot of information on this side, but some key points from us around transition. Firstly, as of today, I think it's important to highlight that the outgoing practical experience rules will continue to apply. So there's some things that we need to put in place, particularly the TRE, as Simon has said, that need to be in place really before we can, or providers can fully implement the new practical experience requirements. So as of now, the old requirements will continue to be there. The second bullet point that I would probably highlight is once the TRE is ready and once all those things are ready to go, then we will work with individual providers to work out how to transition as is best for them. You're all going to be on, or providers are all on different cycles when it comes to when they run their existing Part 3s and practice qualifications and so on. And we don't want to disadvantage anybody, and we don't want to make it more difficult than it needs to be. So we'll work with you individually to figure out the best way to move from the old to the new. And then the third bullet point following on from that is that everybody does need to be following the new PPE requirements by the 30th or 1st of December 2028. One other point that I'd probably pick up, because some of you may have questions around this, as well as the PPE requirements, we've also made some changes to our standards providers. I think it's important to mention that for those who are already in the process of us reviewing those standards and the previous iteration of standard 6.3, we'll continue to carry on with that review under the old standard. You're not going to have to change and meet new stuff midway through your new application or your transition or whatever it might be. And we'll find a logical way of testing that new standard 6.3 probably at some point from kind of mid 2027 onwards, once everything is in place and people are much closer to moving across to the new stuff. So I think those are the key messages. Firstly, the old stuff continues to apply as of today. Secondly, we'll work with you individually to get you transferred to the new. And thirdly, that deadline for us is the 31st of December 2028. So those are the key bits around transition.
So thanks, Grant. So obviously there's been a lot of detail that we've kind of just transmitted at you quite quickly. A lot of more information is available on our website. But I think what we'd like to do now is use the rest of the session to hear your questions or pick up on anything that needs any further explanation. Just to kind of re-stress Grant's point, there's a lot of information now. Once you've digested it, you may have some very specific questions that relate to your particular circumstance, whether you be an employee, whether you be a trainee, or particularly if you're a learning provider, what you need to do. We're always really happy to kind of deal with those questions individually. But certainly if people have got any more general questions about the whole proposal, it's not just a proposal, the whole development, then yeah, please put them into chats. Finn.
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come in already, and thanks again as well to those of you who submitted them in advance. We've got a really straightforward one here, I think, and it's from an anonymous attendee, which says, "What is a practice level qualifications?" And they've asked if we can illustrate that with an example of, so in really simple terms. And I guess this is a question. I mean, Grant, maybe you'd like to take this one. What is a practice level qualification? What does
Yeah,
that
so the
actually
practice
mean?
outcomes, a practice qualification in most cases will be transitioned across from existing Part 3 qualifications. So most existing Part 3 qualifications can be adapted fairly easy to meet all of the practice qualification. I say fairly easy. They can be adapted to meet all of the practice qualification requirements and competencies. So in 99% of cases, there'll be the what were Part 3 qualifications, or may still be Part 3 qualifications, transitioned across to practice qualifications.
Great, thank you. And we've got I think it's sort of like a natural follow-on question here from Wendy Colvin. What happens to graduates who are not on a practice qualification? What oversight can they expect if they are working in practice? Will ARB publish guidance for those graduates? Simon, would you maybe like to take this one?
Yeah. Hi, Wendy. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Finn?
Yeah, I've just flagged it in the Q&A. What happens to graduates who are not on a practice qualification? What oversight can they expect if they are working in practice?
So that would extend, Wendy, that would extend beyond our disciplinary remit, because obviously our remit is only in relation to those trainees who are currently enrolled on a qualification that's accredited or to be accredited. That said, um, as long as they're employed by a practice with a registered architect, the architect is still bound by the code of conduct, is still bound by the guidance supporting the code of conduct on mentoring. So there is still that to a certain degree, that regulatory umbrella. But these proposals wouldn't impact on those particular trainees.
Great, thank you. Um, this was a question that was sent in from India as part of registration. India said, I'm concerned about the lack of work placements for the new system. What happens if placements are not available? I mean, it's a question for both of you, really, I suppose. I mean, is that something that we're tackling with the changes that we've announced today?
To a certain degree, I mean, I think we have to be realistic about the impact that we can have. We can't create jobs where jobs don't exist. What we hope to be able to do is be part of the solution to bring clarity, and where there's clarity, particularly for employers, then hopefully they will be more interested and more amenable to be taking on trainees. But I think it's fair to say, India, that this can't be this isn't a solution to employment issues and the potential lack of opportunities for younger people, particularly across industry, but particularly within architecture. I think we have to be realistic about that.
Mhm. This is quite an interesting one from Andrew here. So noted under the proposals published today, a mentor can be any professional, but could be an architect. And if so, we need to follow ARB's mentoring guidance. And in addition, the TRE should be corroborated by a registered architect. Is it correct to presume this means registered in the UK? And further, could the corroborating architect be an employee of a learning provider? So a PSA in other terms.
Uh, Hi, Andrew. The answer to that is yes to both. UK, a registered architect or on our register. They don't necessarily have to be in the UK, but on our register. And I can see no issue with them also being the employee of a learning provider. The purpose of it is, of course, to have that kind of to ensure that the corroboration is a correct one. So the fact that it's being signed off by a professional person that falls within our disciplinary purview is the important matter.
There's a question here from Ryan, and again, it's kind of an easy one to answer. So where can I find a copy of the guidance documents? They're on our website, but we will also be sending, I'll pop them into the chat actually at some point during this webinar, and we'll also include them as follow-up for everybody who's here today as well, just to gather them there as well. So we'll be sending them your way, Ryan. This question here, again, I mean, second one from Ryan. What qualifies someone or a practice to be a learning provider? So again, maybe we just need to be clear. What do we mean when we talk about a learning provider?
So
Correct.
a learning provider is somebody who awards qualifications. They would
Yeah,
normally be, in parlance, universities or Part 3 providers. It wouldn't be a practice.
yeah, to be clear, it's sort of like a catch-all term, but I think in most cases it is going to be a university.
Yes.
Um, there's a question here, and again, maybe we sort of addressed this one earlier. It's from an anonymous attendee. So, are students expected to complete both PEDRs and a trainee record of experience? Again, some you kind of spoke to this point earlier, didn't you?
Yeah, but just to be clear, because I understand that there may be some confusion. No, because a PEDR is the trainee record of experience. What we are hoping with our colleagues in the RIBA is that the PEDR is going to be updated to ensure that it meets all the requirements of the training record experience. So therefore, that is the thing that a trainee will be able to use. There may be other record of experience that are developed by other institutions, but at the moment, the RIBA one is the one that we anticipate coming online.
We've got a question here from Jonathan. So Jonathan has asked, is there a minimum time spent under each category or specific learning outcomes to meet for each of the competency outcomes within the TRE? And what level of study or training will the TRE apply? Will it be post part 2 or part 1 to use the old parlance?
So just splitting those questions up,
Mm.
no, there is no minimum period of time because we think time is a really bad proxy for competence. And it would be for the learning provider ultimately to assess whether the trainee has met the outcome, whether that be part of the academic outcomes or the practice outcomes. And the second part of the question, Finn, was
Second part, I'm just pulling it back up again. Oh, so what level of studying or training will the TRE apply? So at what stage is
the
the trainee
TRE.
going to
Well,
have to engage with the
the
TRE?
TRE applies to the practice outcomes. Now, as new qualifications develop, that would normally be post part two in the traditional system. You do that at part three. We now have qualifications that are mixing and matching and combining practice and academic outcomes, but it's relating to those practice outcomes.
Grant, I think, did you want to come in on that question as well?
Yeah, well, also it ties in a little bit to Timothy's question. And as Simon has just alluded to, we, during the transition, are quite comfortable for people to mix and match old Part 2s with new practice qualifications. So if they've got an old Part 2 and the university or the provider thinks they're ready to join the practice qualification, then they can do that.
Sorry, Alice, that's Timothy's question. I've just flagged it
Yeah.
there. So what will happen to people with old Part 2s who haven't yet met the new academic outcomes in full, and how will they be eligible to take the practice outcomes assessment?
So they can just undertake those. The university may want to do a little bit of work with them where they feel there are kind of bigger gaps between the academic outcomes and the old Part 2, particularly in relation to the practice elements.
Mhm.
But there's no additional work that needs to be done from our side. They can just go straight in and do those.
We've got another sort of transition related question here from Wendy again. So I might stay with you, Grant, if that's okay. If a program that has gone through the transition and is running to the new practice qualification soon, as in from December 2027, do students on that program need 2 years?
It will kind of depend
Mm.
on when the TRE stuff is ready. So it needs to be kind of one or the other. So if, for example, all the TRE stuff was ready by the end of this year, then really as soon as the university is ready to implement and use that, they can do that as soon as it's up and running. So those students could follow the new practice requirements if you're ready to allow them to do so.
Mhm. We've got another question from Andrew here, and it's about sort of the application of the standards of the code in relation to trainees. So it's from the guidance for trainees. Although you are not yet an architect, you should understand and act in accordance with the architect's code of conduct and practice. And Andrew says, isn't this a bit of a high bar for a trainee? Simon, do you maybe want to respond to that one as to the
Yeah, I
new
mean, I think we need to. I
inclusion of
think
that?
yeah, we probably need to stress that this is guidance only. But certainly one of the purposes of guidance is to try and shift behaviors in a positive way. And I fail to see anything that's problematic with telling a future architect, here is the code of conduct, you should be prepared and ready and to begin to practice in accordance with it. Of course, if they don't, not only is it number one, only guidance, and you can't breach guidance, and number two, they're not even an architect yet, so there would be no consequences flowing from it. But the reason for that is, as I say, is to try and shift behaviors and get them prepared. One of the reasons to be prepared, and it's part of the practice outcome as well in relation to ethics, is to prepare them for practice.
We've got an interesting question here from Patrick. Grant, I might come to you. It's a two-part question, so maybe let's
Yeah.
do it part by part. Um, First part of the question, can learning institutions transition to the new system straight away?
So the answer to that question is no, because the part of the critical element of not having a minimum 2-year period was introducing the record of experience, so that 2-year period was replaced by somebody undertaking the right kind of experience in order to sit the new practice qualification and hopefully pass it. So that record of experience infrastructure needs to be ready before you can stop doing the old 2-year requirement. So as soon as that it's ready, then yes, absolutely,
Mhm.
universities can transition, providers can transition.
And the second part of Patrick's question is, will R be reviewing or signing off institutions' trainee records of experience? So I guess what Patrick is asking there is, are we going to be signing off if a learning provider independently develops a TRE? What's our level of involvement going to be in that?
okay, so there's probably a few things in there. So we will not, for example, sign off individual student record of experience. So there's currently about, I don't know, about 3,000 students currently doing practical experience of some kind of another. So we're not going to go down the road of signing off all those individual records. What we will want to know is that providers have a mechanism for checking and working with students to review that record of experience. So either using the adapted PEDR, or if somebody else was to come up with one that met our requirements, then we could approve that record, but we won't be signing off individual student records. No.
I'm just referring back to some of the ones that were submitted in advance, just to make sure that we are not forgetting about those as well. We do have one here. It's a question from John. Please could you clarify the extent of a learning provider's obligation to students on a program with a year in industry where the program is not mapped to the practice outcome? Grant, do you maybe want to take that one?
Yeah. So the year in industry is usually attached to a master's level qualification. I don't know of any that might be attached to a practice qualification. The record of experience will only apply to practice qualifications, because that's when students are getting ready to sit the part 3. So the TRE bit won't necessarily apply to the year out in industry. If a university, though, felt that a student was in the right place and with the right employer and getting the right kind of experience to be able to start completing that TRE during that year in industry, they could absolutely start doing it. But there would be no specific requirement for us, and it would be between the employer, I guess, the employee and the university. Probably the other thing to say on that is that some of the new standard 6.3 applies not just to practice qualifications, but also to master's level qualifications, just around the kind of advice that students get and informing students about where to go. And those standards, or those part of the standard, applies whether they're in a what's the word, whether they're in a year in practice, or whether they're not, so, or have a year industry or not.
We've got a question here from Andrew, which is around the double counting rule and its removal. So Andrew has asked, the documents published this morning don't appear to contain much reference to the removal of the double counting rule, which ARB have previously said they intend to implement. Granted, there won't be any counting in a numerical sense, with the minimum 24 months removed, but will students or trainees be able to rely on practice experience gained while studying for the academic outcomes via the TRE towards a later or concurrent practice outcomes award? It's got a long question. Simon, do you maybe want to take this one?
Yeah, the answer to that is, I think the answer to that, Andrew, is yes to the whole question. There is no double counting rule because there's no counting anymore. So you're right. And so yes to that part, and also yes to they can absolutely use the experience that they have achieved in order to demonstrate the practice outcomes, certainly.
There's an interesting one from Jonathan here. Can the TRE be a standalone, or is it meant to be explicitly tied to the part 3? And by part 3, I guess, do you mean
Yeah,
practice
yeah.
qualification?
So it can absolutely be used. I mean, there's real value and utility in just using the record of experience anyway. And I certainly know that the way that the RIBA's PEDR is going to be designed is where it won't just be mapped against the practice outcomes. It'll be mapped against the rebus stages as well. So there's no prohibition in it being used generally. It's just it must be used in relation to the practice outcomes.
And just again, sorry, I'm just referring back to the ones that were sent in advance. There's a question here from Madeline, and the question is essentially she's remarked on the difference there is between architectural education and architectural practice, and she said that they are different. Are the changes today, are they going to do anything, do we think, to sort of draw them closer together? Or, I mean, I'm not sure. it's kind of a question, or do either of you have a kind of comment on that, sort of what we're really trying to do with the changes that we're introducing today?
So I mean, this isn't necessarily in relation to this particular piece of work, but if you think about where we've been since 2021, 2022, when we acknowledged through the feedback and research that we've done that historically architectural education was probably a little bit divorced from the requirements of practice, particularly in relation to the technical requirements of practice. That's what we heard back consistently. So we have changed the competence outcomes, whether they be the academic outcomes or the practice outcomes, to try and better reflect the realities of practice. Obviously, that is going to take some time to flow through the new qualifications and the new curricula. So I think it's a fair criticism that Madeline makes, but ones that we hope that we will have addressed. But it'll just take some time for that to be to come through.
There is a question here from John as well, who, and again, it's kind of a long question, but it's sort of basically making the point, are we changing the standard required to become an architect, I guess is the question in sort of simplest terms. Do the changes today, I mean, do they have any bearing on sort of the standard required to join the register?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and it's really important to stress that no, it doesn't. It doesn't. The fact that we're removing the 2 years does not change in one jot the requirement to become, the competence levels required to become an architect. They are set out in the competence outcomes. They all must be met. What we are hoping to do and endeavoring to do is to increase flexibility and increase quality and clarity of how trainees can get to that point. But that point of requirement of competence remains consistent, that everybody must meet.
And there's a question here from Colin, which is about the removal of time requirement. So Colin has asked, with the removal of time requirement, presumably the minimum time for spent gaining experience, so example, 20 hours a week, are also being removed. So trainees can complete TRE if they are working part-time. If so, is there a minimum? For example, would 1 day a week qualify?
Not that we would set. No, I mean that would be for the learning provider to work in conjunction with the trainee to ensure about that they're getting enough quality experience to meet the outcomes. But as I said, we just think that time spent is a poor proxy.
There's kind of an interesting one again from an anonymous attendee here, just about the language that we're using. So they've asked, or they've remarked, my understanding from the initial proposals was that the intention was to was to change students to trainees. I noticed that throughout the documentation released today, both are used. Is this a mandatory change of language or a preference? And at what stage does a student become a trainee? It's kind of a nuanced one. Simon, would you like to try and tackle that one?
Yeah, it is. Was it John that asked? Yeah, it's something that's caused us a disproportionate amount of angst. Of course, at the moment we are essentially running two systems. We're still running the old part 1, 2, and 3, and we're running the new system. So the old parts 2, well, particularly part 2 and 3, is always referred to students. We're trying to move to trainees. That was one of the recommendations of the PPE Commission. So in time, it will all revolve through to trainee, but we have to recognise the fact that there are still some people going through the original system. It's not ideal. But that's the reason for it, John.
So I've still got a few open ones here. I mean, we've got one here from John Tollett. As the apprenticeship programs are working their way through the existing course from coming year 2 through to EPA in 2029 at the earliest, will they be able to continue with existing PEDRs to point of submission for Gateway or need to transition before that date?
Do you want me to come on this one, Finn?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, Grant,
Yeah.
because it's more technical.
Yeah, so I think we recognise firstly that apprenticeship qualifications are a bit of a unique case when it comes to our transition because they don't follow the same kind of timeline as either full-time qualifications or necessarily even part-time qualifications, and it's much more difficult to move students across from kind of one variant to the new transitioned. So I think talk us to us individually. I know that because I've recently emailed a lot of schools that many existing level 7 apprenticeship qualifications are just going to run out, not because of anything they've done, but because of the change to government funding. I think where you're going to run out your existing level 7 apprenticeship, just stick with the PDR and where you are currently. There is no point you making lots of changes knowing that that qualification is going to run out by the time we complete our transition. If you are planning to transition your apprenticeship to the new standards and the new outcomes, then we'll have a discussion with you individually about that.
I mean, I guess that's the reassurance we'd give to any learning provider on this call as well,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
Is that, do come and talk to us. And I think if you have those sorts of more technical questions, I mean, just email us, talk to us, and we'll be able to help you figure it out. I'm just looking through the questions that we still have here. I'm trying to make sure that we aren't just sort of going back over things that we've already covered in the Q&A, or indeed the presentation itself. So I might just at this point run just a short poll just to ask, have people found the session today useful? So that should be on your screens now. We've got a question here from India. It's a question about terminology. So is there a very simple guide on the new terminology as there is much confusion? So here's the example, PDRs changing to trainee record of experience, or part 3 being called a practice qualification. I mean, Simon, do you maybe want to pick up on that question just around the terminology and sort of what's current and what we're using and sort of how it relates to stuff like PDR and part 3?
Do you know what? Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and that's something that we could maybe publish a taxonomy, because I mean, even we get confused sometimes with the amount of acronyms that are banded around. So if we haven't got one on the website, and I don't think we have at the moment, I'm looking at you, Finn, I think that's a really good suggestion, and we can do that because obviously we work with this on a daily basis, and we become probably a little lazy in terms of acronyms and terminology, and we don't want it to be inaccessible to those people who don't. So thanks for the suggestion. We'll definitely take that up.
Okay, with that, I think I might start bringing this session to a close. So I guess just to finish up, I'd like to say thank you to Simon and Grant and to all of you who are on the call with us today. And big thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We covered a lot today. I'm really conscious that we published a lot today. And I really hope that the session has helped to explain what the changes mean and how they'll work in practice. So we know that these changes to professional practical experience are important to trainees, to learning providers, to the employers who employ trainees, and to others across the profession. So we do really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and to engage with the discussion. As I mentioned at the start, today's session was recorded. We will share it with you. And we'll also include links to all of the documents and all the materials that we've referred to today. Just so, again, you have them in one place, but they're also all available on the ARB website as well. If we haven't been able to answer your question today, and again, sort of coming back to, if you do have follow-up questions that are sort of specific, if you're a learning provider and they're specific to your course and the transition, as I say, please do get in touch. But yeah, other than that, I just want to say thank you one more time to Simon and Grant, and yeah, to you for joining us on the call. Thank you all.